Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to start to turn this little piece of code that we have here into more of an actual game. Okay. And by that, I mean, we're going to start to introduce the idea of having game states. We're going to have different states in our program, which means we'll be able to have a little bit more of a progression, right? In the case of this simple game, we're going to go from an intro screen to a bit of code that allows us to play the game. And then when we lose, we're going to have a game over screen, and we'll be able to kind of jump back into the game if we want to. Okay. So let's kind of talk through the problem here with a few slides. So the issue that we have is that currently we need to figure out a way for our program to have more than one state, which means at any particular time, right, we might want to be doing different things. Currently, we've only ever written programs that have this flow, right? So we have setup that runs once in the beginning, and then we jump into draw, and then that in turn becomes an infinite loop that repeats, right? So currently, all the programs we've written so far are only ever in one state, which is the draw state, right? Not counting setup, which is, happens really quickly, is just once. Okay? In the case of the game we're building, our game needs more than those two states, right? We do setup here, and in fact, technically we have preload, which happens before setup. It's not part of this diagram, but you get the idea. So from setup, we want to be able to jump into this intro state, right? Intro might have some animations running, right? It's not necessarily just a static screen, but it's just a state that our program is in. We're going to wait for the player to do something. We're in this intro mode, okay? And then our program is going to jump into the actual game where we start to draw the player and the zombies, and then we play the game. The score goes up, right? The music is playing. And then when the zombie catches us, we're going to move to a different state where we tell the player, oh, the game is over. Here's the freeze frame of where you were. Here's your current score and some instructions on how to try again. And then from there, we might jump back into our game state, right? So the flow of our program is now very different. Instead of just set up into draw, we have set up into intro, into game over, and back into game, okay? So we still have to work though within the constraint of having the draw function, because that's how P5 is structured. So what we need to do is break down draw into three different parts, right? So at any point in time, we might want to be into one of three possible states inside draw. Okay? And the solution to that is going to be quite straightforward. We're going to simply make these functions, and kind of going back to the very first use case we had for functions. Functions, yes, we can make reusable bundles of code, but we can also just use them to create labeled sections of our program that we can simply call upon. Okay? So imagine we create an intro function, a game function, and a game over function. Right? And then we have some kind of switching mechanism inside draw that allows us to go into one of these at any given time, only one, right? And that would basically solve our problem. So let's take a look at how we would do this in the code over here. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to declare three different functions. Okay, we're going to put them, I don't know, after draw, I guess. Put them here. We're going to create an intro function. Okay. We're going to create let's call it run game function. And we're going to create a game over function. And again, I'm just making up these names like with everything else. These are not predefined names or anything like this. These three just happen to work for the game that we're trying to build. Okay? And the idea is that we're going to partition draw so that at any given time, we can run one of these functions, right? But only one. So right now, draw is doing this, which is basically going to be our run game code. Okay, so let's take that out of draw and let's park it into run game. Okay. So if I wanted to run the game, I could say run game, right? And then I hit play, and then we're back to here. Okay? We might want to add something for the intro, right? So let's say in the intro screen, we're going to set a black background. And here we're going to draw some text. So let's set a white, let's say text. We're going to say zombie apocalypse. And we're going to center this in the window. Okay. And I will set a green fill. Okay. And then below that, let's make that big. It's a text size 60. And then below that, in smaller text, we can tweak that later on. This is just a starting point. Okay? We'll say player select, also centered. Actually, this is going to be in the middle. This is going to be height over 4. Okay, so just it's more up top here. Set a white fill. Okay, and then at the bottom, we're going to draw an image of our player. We're going to say M player frame 0. Let's just draw the first frame from the animation sequence, and we're going to draw that in the center, and we want, let's say, 3/4 of the height. Okay, so let's do that times 0.75. Okay, so we'll work on that in the finishing touches section, the final video this week, but this is just a starting point. Okay, so if I wanted to draw my intro screen now, instead of run game, I could go intro, right? So in draw, now I'm going to call it a different section of the code. Okay? So this looks like that, and I forgot to do in setup, text align, center. Okay, we're going to center align our text. Yeah, that's a little better. Okay, so now I have a function called intro, a function called run game, right? And I can do one or the other. This is run game, and this is intro. We could also put something in the game over code, right? So game over, for now, maybe what's game over? We'll say background black as well. We're going to do a freeze frame. So we're going to say player.draw, zombie.draw, but we're not going to move or animate them. Okay. And then we'll draw some text. We'll say game over. And let's put at the top. Put that in red because it's bad. And then at the bottom here, actually, let's copy this. At the bottom, we'll put some text that says, click to try again. Okay. So this is now going to be my game over state. Let's see what that looks like. I'm going to comment this out. We'll say game over. Okay. All right, so this might be the game over state. So player is stuck up here. The zombie is down here. It says click to try again. Okay. So what we did is we've created a separate function for each of the different states we want our game to be in. And the reason we're doing this is that it creates kind of a container for the code, right? That makes it a little bit easier to manage rather than try to make everything happen into draw, which is going to eventually turn into this massive, huge, super long function. This allows us to break it down into logical chunks, right? And now all we got to do is figure out how do we switch between these as the game is running, okay? So the answer to that is very straightforward. If we say it out loud even, the answer will come, right? We'll say, if we want the game state to be in the intro state, then run the intro code. If we want the game state to be in run game, run the game code, and so forth. So we have the word if in there, which is a good sign that we probably need to use ask a question using an if statement. So how do we know which game state we're in? Well, there's different strategies we can use for that, but by far the simplest is just think of it as we're going to define a variable. Okay, we're going to say, let's create a variable here. We're going to call it game state. Okay, so this variable is going to contain a value that's going to indicate which game state we're in. Okay? And we can make that a string, right? We could put the value intro in there, and that would mean we're playing the intro state and so forth. Strings are easy to do typos within, and the program won't tell you if you make a typo in your string. So one thing that I like to do instead is to define, we could define constants. Okay, so this is a good example of when we might use a const variable. We're going to create a const and we're going to call it intro, And so we remember this is a constant variable, which means a variable we create once and never change again. We're going to put it in all caps. And the idea here is we're going to assign a number to each game state. Okay, very simple. We'll say intro is 0, run game is 1, and game over is 2. Okay, so just as long as they're not the same, we're good. It could be any number. And if we were to add more game states, we would just keep going and add more numbers. And then in the beginning, we will set game state equal to intro. So all this is going to do is set number 0, number 1, or number 2 into this variable. But instead of having to remember which number is which, we created constants. So we can use these labels here instead of the number itself. Okay. So now we have a variable that is going to act as kind of like a switcher. Okay. So if the game state is intro, right, we run the intro code. If game state is run game, we do the run game code. And if game state is game over, we do the game over code, right? Simple. And because the variable can only ever have one value, right? This function draw here is going to run one of these, but not all three, right, at any given time. If we want to make sure that this is the case, okay, we could be extra careful here, and instead of writing it as 3 separate ifs, right, we're going to write it as else if and else if. Okay? So this ensures that these 3 are connected in essentially a 3-path intersection, and only one of these branches can ever happen in one span of the draw function, depending on the value of game state. Why do we do this? Well, in case run game or game over or intro makes changes to the game state, this will ensure that for simplicity, right, the changes won't take effect until the next frame of our game. Okay, so we can write it like this. And notice I don't need the curly brackets, right, if my if statement all fits on one line. Okay, so I could also write that. That would work too. But because we only have one line of code, it's okay to just put it at the end there. Because it all fits on one line, we can do away with the curly brackets. Okay? So this is nice and compact, easy to read. And now our program overall state, right? Our draw function has essentially been divided into 3 possible bins, 3 possible sections. If I hit play here, because we set the game state to intro in the beginning, we start with the intro screen. Okay. So how do we move between states? Well, it's simply a matter of changing whatever is inside game state. If we put another number in there, draw is going to flow into a different section of the code. So for instance, if we wanted to select the player on mouse pressed, right, let's go after game over here, after collision, let's implement mouse pressed. Okay, we could say if game state equals intro, right, then game state equals run game. In other words, if we were in the intro state, now it's time to move to the run game state. Okay, now I click, I can jump into this stage of my program. Okay? Now similarly, we have collisions, right? So when the zombie catches us, right, we know this happens over here. Instead of drawing some text saying ouch, we can simply say game state equals game over, right? So if the zombie catches us, then we move to the next game state. Now the program is going to all of a sudden start to run the game over code. Now notice I can't move my player anymore. The zombie is frozen. That's because in the game over state, right? Remember, all we're doing is where is it? It's right there. All we're doing is just drawing the player and the zombie. We stop moving and animating them. Click to try again, right? Same idea. We could go back to mouse pressed. We could say over here, if the game, we'll say else if. If the game state is equal to game over, right? Game state equals run game. And I'm doing this as else ifs, again, just to avoid one mouse press accidentally kind of triggering, taking me to one game state and then another. This doesn't happen here, but this is cautious. Like one mouse press should only cause one game state change. So I'm connecting these two if statement as two pathways instead of separate ifs. So now I can get caught by the zombie. I can click to try again. Okay. Already we can see if I try again and if I keep pressing on the same place, there's room for improvement here. We're going to talk about this in the finishing touches. When we click to try again, we're going to reset the game state and so forth. So we're not going to worry about that at this stage just yet. Okay. All right. So let's take a step back here and recap. So what we did in this video is now we have something that starts to look a little bit more, like a game, right? We have created a structure where now our program has a flow to it. We start into this intro screen, right? We define this up here. And then in draw, because game state equals intro, we run the intro function. The intro function is simply, in this case, there's no animation or anything like that, but there could be, right? It's just going to do this over and over until, right, we select a player. Or in this case, we just press the mouse. We haven't really checked. In the final version, we're going to choose between two different player options. So we're going to do that in the final video. But for now, we're just mouse press is taking us into the game. Okay. So when we press the mouse, all it means to kind of flow between these game states is simply update the game state function to point us in the right direction. So if we were in the intro mode, now it's time to run the game, right? And now draw is going to do something different because we've kind of separated it out using this if statement. Now we're doing this, run game, right? Until there's a collision, right? And then that's going to change the game state to game over. And all of a sudden, this code no longer runs. Now we jump into game over. So this allows us to kind of have a different flow to our program than just the setup and draw that we've been working with so far. We can now have these different states and we can flow between them as needed. How we transition and when, that's obviously the core of the game logic, and that's going to be different for every project. But the code becomes now a matter of figuring out how to go from one state to another, at what time, based on what conditions, right? But the mechanics of how to transition are very simple. It just means change the value inside the game state variable. And now we don't have to ever touch our draw function ever again, right? It's always going to be one of these three. And if we want to go and make updates to them, then we go and update the code for the intro function or the run game function or the game over function. Okay. All right. So a very basic framework that allows us to have more of a flow to our program. And of course, you can have as many possible states as your game requires, right? Maybe you have levels, in which case maybe your run game function takes a parameter, right? Which level are you on? And that value can be used in here to change the difficulty level, maybe change the color or the background, right? So you could build on that idea, but the fundamental concept is the same, right? So we're going to leave it at that for this particular lesson. In the final video this week, now that we have all these ingredients in place, right? We have the player and the zombie, we have flow through the different states, which means in effect, we kind of have a game. I mean, it's a pretty crappy game, but it's starting to look like a game where we can get the player and then we can go to game over. We're obviously missing some ingredients. So we don't have a score. We only have one enemy, which is pretty crappy. So we're going to do the finishing touches in the final video where we're going to talk about adding the score, adding the player select, and then getting the number of zombies to grow over time so that there's a little bit of a challenge. I'll see you in that final lesson.